Okay, we're back to Sermon on the Mount, and I'm excited about today. I'm excited about all of them. This is actually a picture of approximately the area the Sermon on the Mount was done on. And that body of water you see in the background? Sea of Galilee. And those mountains in the far background over there, they're on the eastern edge of the Sea of Galilee. Those are the mountains at the foot of which Jesus got in the boat and went across the Sea of Galilee and healed the man who had all the demons in him. That's the place over there. So that's kind of where we're at right here. We're up the hill from Capernaum, the fishing village. So that's approximately where it's at. But before we get into the content for today, we start with this instead. So give a watch right here. Well, good morning. I know it's a little strange, and you're probably wondering why I'm here. And I'll explain it at the end this morning. But as we go into the Sermon on the Mount, this actually does make sense. But you're going to have to wait till the end to find out why. So stick with us as we look at Matthew 6. Shameless. I got hooked on doing those videos for the last 6 weeks, so I just had to give you a little bit of video. That's the whole thing. But it actually does connect. So let's see why. So here we go. We're in Matthew 6, and we'll just jump right into it. Matthew 6, verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. Well, yeah, this word seen up here, actually the Greek word is the word that we get the word theater from. So beware of practicing your righteousness before other people so that you're acting on a stage in front of them. So this is clearly what he's saying. And when we look at this, we say to ourselves, well, I don't do that. Actually, you do. So let's kind of explore it, because on first glance, it seems like it doesn't quite really apply to us. So he's going to apply it in 3 different areas of our religious life, quote unquote. And you have to remember, during Jesus' time, the religious life was the public life. It was the dominant public life, was the religious life. So what Jesus is going to point to right here is that you don't want to be doing this outward stuff for how people are going to view you, how you're going to be seen, how you're going to be a theater for them. So 3 areas. The first area, he'll go in verse 2. Thus, when you give to the needy, or alms, that's what that's all about, helping people who are poor. The second area in verse 5, when you pray, don't do it to be seen by people. And then the third area in verse 16, and when you fast, don't do it so that people see you. So I put the most luscious thing in that little circle I could think of for fasting. It's cheeseburgers. So today, we're not going to do all 3 of those. We're going to leave the 2 and 3. We're going to leave those for next time. So today, all we're going to talk about is when you give to the needy, don't do it to be seen by other people. So let's see what he says. He goes in and he says, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do at the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received the reward. Thank you. You could tell he was running out of breath at the end of that. So don't sound a trumpet as you do this, but as the hypocrites do. So you're giving to the poor, right? And he's saying, don't go sound trumpet. Now, I looked into this because I thought for years this is literally what they did. They would go around when they'd give to the poor. They'd march through the streets and so on, where the trumpet would go ahead of them. That's what a trumpet looks like back then. It's made from a ram's horn. And, try and walk around. And I thought, well, that seems kind of crazy. It actually is kind of crazy. They never did that. What? So then some people said, I read some commentators saying, well, there was this idea that maybe it was the sound of your coins going into the receptacle of the temple. It was actually a metal device, and when you put your coins in there, it would go ka-ching, 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 and it would ring. So that's what he's talking about. No, that's not it either. That's been debunked. So why does Jesus say this? This seems pretty severe. When you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets. And that clue right there tells you that the hypocrites do where? Not at the temple, but in the synagogues and in the streets. So do they go around with trumpets at the synagogues and the streets? No, literally they don't. So what Jesus is using here is kind of some hyperbole. In fact, we use this figure of speech right now. Instead of saying that, we say, don't go blowing your own horn. That's all it is. So it's the hyperbole of when you do this thing where you give to the poor, don't go around blowing your own horn that that's what you did. That's really what he's saying. And he'll come back to some hyperbole later on in this verse too, so you can tell that's what he's doing. So the idea is that we give to the poor. You shouldn't be strutting around saying, aren't I great? Aren't I great? I gave to the poor today. And for many of us, we can't relate to that because we don't do that. That seems just so egregiously wrong to do. But we sort of do it, and that's what we're going to explore today. But he says, here's what you need to do instead. When you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing so that your giving may be in secret. See, there's the hyperbole back. Does your left hand ever not know what your right hand is doing? No. But he's saying it needs to be so secret in the sense that even within you, your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing. It's got to be that completely non-public in every sense when you give to the poor. So make it in secret, and then finally he says, and as a result of that, your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So I mean, every time I read this, I look at this and say, well, I'm not guilty of this. So I'm not really sure he's talking to me. When I give to other people, I don't go walking around heralding it in front of people and blowing any trumpets. I don't go home and tell people, you know what I did? I gave $10 to that person on the street. We don't do that. Well, we sort of do this, but it's not in this context. So that's what I want to explore. This giving he talks about, I want to talk about first, is not the giving that happens in church, by the way. Even though this is what we introduced last week as problems in piety, this is not giving in church that's the problem. This is the issue of giving in another context. That's to the poor, to the ones who have nothing. And so this is where it starts to come home a little bit, because this context of giving, many of us don't do much of. Now, part of the reason is because we don't see people laying on the streets usually where we live, and the need is not as obvious. But what Jesus is saying is, erase from your mind we're talking about when you give on Sunday mornings and going around and trumpeting that around. That's not the issue. The issue is giving to the poor, period. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this, because this was a gigantic ethic in the nation of Israel, giving to the poor. And I want you to see how really important this was. This wasn't an optional thing. This is actually the lifeblood of a follower of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This was the core. This was the core. So let's look at that first. In Deuteronomy 15, verse 11, he says, "For there will never cease to be poor in the land." Does that sound familiar? Jesus said that. Oh, he quoted Deuteronomy 15. "There'll never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in the land." By the way, those of us who were into religious lists of what to do and don't do, did he say 10%? No. How much did he say? Open-handed, yeah. So that's the attitude, is open-handedness. For the hand of your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land. In fact, this word alms in the Old Testament is exactly the same Hebrew word as the word for righteousness. So this idea of being righteous, that is, living out who God is, God's character in our life, it was so synonymous with giving to those who are needy that they used exactly the same word. Righteousness and alms are one and the same in the Old Testament, which is it's pretty fascinating. That's how way up there it is. And again, when I read this, I realized, giving to the poor is not that high on my list. I mean, it's okay. It's in here and it's not down here. But to me, it seems sort of like an optional middle ground thing. Here in the Old Testament, righteousness without giving to the poor doesn't have any sense to it. They're one and the same. So a righteous person in the Old Testament was someone who had their hand open freely to those who had less. That's how important it was. That's why we can't just skip over this, because I think part of the problem is we don't understand this. Psalm 37:21. "The wicked borrows but does not pay back, but the righteous is generous and gives." The righteous, so you can't be righteous and not be generous in giving. That's how synonymous those are. So this is a huge issue. And Jesus says, when you do this, don't do it so anyone's watching you. Do it so it's in secret. Job, when he's having his discussion with his quote unquote friends, after Job has lost everything, and they try and indict him for being an evil and an unrighteous guy, the back and forth. This is part of it. When Job comes back, he says, "Look, when the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it approved." That is, those who look at my life, you'll see me as blessed and approved. "Because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help him." So Job isn't really blowing his horn right here, but what he's trying to say is if you inspect my life, listen to what I've done, look at what I've done, you will see that my life has been characterized by delivering the poor who cried out for help and for helping those who have less. So that's his definition from a biblical standpoint. That's his definition of a righteous life. He's living a righteous life. He doesn't just say in this line, look at my life, listen to what I do, you'll see righteousness. He says, look at my life, listen to what I do, and you will see someone who cares for the poor. So that's how synonymous this is. He says, I delivered the poor who cried for help and the fatherless who had none to help him. I really like this pair of phrases. I delivered the poor who cried for help and the fatherless who had none to help him. The fatherless, when there is no father, there's no one to take care of children. I mean, and the woman didn't have a job. She couldn't do the fields by herself. I mean, it was tough. So the fatherless was something that God said to the nation of Israel, this is part and parcel of how I'll judge you. I want you to be very careful how you care for the fatherless, how you care for the widow, how you care for orphans, how you care for strangers. And in that collection of statements right there, he has made clear all the people who are needy, who have no one else who is engaged on their behalf in the natural course of the culture. So, he says, when you encounter widows in your culture, when you encounter orphans who have no parents, when you encounter strangers who have no relatives in the area to take care of them, all of these situations, when you encounter them, you take care of them, because that's what my people do. Now, when you look at this pair of phrases, it also reminds me that this is what God does. And this is why this is a very key deal. Remember last week Jesus says, do these things and you'll show that you're a son of God, that you're part of me when you do the things that I would do in your shoes. We use that phrase, what would Jesus do? Yeah, that's exactly it. What would God do in our circumstance? This is it. This is what God has done for us. You see, so when we see people in the sphere of our experience who are needy, who are crying out for help, it reminds us that there was a time in our lives where we were needy and we were crying out for help. We had no other resources, no one else who was kind of in our court per se, but God came and did this for me. So this is key. Remember at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus made kind of what we would think in modern evangelical circles, a blasphemous statement. He said, let your good works shine. But for what purpose? In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Because we normally would read that, from the blasphemous modern evangelical perspective, saying, no, I don't want my good works to shine. In fact, didn't Jesus just say that if you give to the poor, do it in secret, so your right hand and left hand don't even know what they're doing? So what is this shine stuff? I don't get it. Jesus is doing both ways. I don't understand what he's saying. What he's saying is that whatever it is you do, your good works, good defined by good meaning God, let them shine, and then people will say that must be what their God is like. So there's a construct in the economy of the body of Christ that God has put together, which is he changes us from the inside. It works its way to the outside of our lives. That is the things that we do. And in the process, it is so uncharacteristic of our culture. People say, I don't get you. Why did you react that way? And we can say, well, I had mercy on those who called out for help because God had mercy on me when I called out for help. And so I've fallen in love with that kind of mercy. I've fallen in love with that kind of chesed, that kind of devotion to people. I do that because he did that to me. John says, we love because he first loved us. And that's exactly right. So suddenly God is recreating in us his heart. And as a result of recreating his heart in us as his children, that heart comes out in our outside actions and it displays who God is. So Jesus says in the beginning of Matthew 5, let your good works shine so they give glory to your Father in heaven. Not glory to you, but glory to your Father in heaven. Again, because the issue is that Jesus is saying that as transformed beings, transformed by the mercies of God, our hearts being transformed, we will start displaying the characteristics of God that are in such high contrast to what our culture is. People will shake their heads and say, I don't know where you're coming from. That's a beautiful thing I see coming out of your life. But can you explain to me why you would react like that? Why is it when you get attacked by your enemies online, and we talked about this last week, you're not lashing out at them? In fact, your response to them seemed to be loving and with a concern for their well-being. I mean, Why is it you do that? Online, you're supposed to whack them back when they whack you. So it's supposed to glorify who God is. And it gives us an opportunity to describe who he is. I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help him. That's God's heart right there. And Job is saying that God led me to do that because I'm his child, and that's what I do, and I love that. So we see God's mercy for the needy, God's mercy for the powerless, God's mercy for the helpless. I mean, in this whole statement. And so when we come to alms, when we talk about giving to those who are in need, who have very little to none, the whole idea is that that's exactly what God would do in your shoes, because that's the business he's in. He's not waiting for you to become worthy before he gives to you and addresses your need or listens to your voice. He does it regardless. We looked at this last week. Remember, Jesus says about God bringing rain and sun for farmers, plots, one who's evil, one who's good. Does God hold back the blessings of sun and rain on the evil person? No. It seems to fall on them as well. I mean, it's God's blessing both as well. So God's not waiting for you to make yourself worthy before he blesses you. He's blessing you regardless. And hence, when you come across someone who's deeply in need, we don't stand above them and say, well, I'd love to help you out, but you need to get your act together first. You need to go out and get a job. You need to go out and clean yourself up. You need to figure out a place to live. I mean, you need to do all those things. And when you prove to me that you're really serious about getting your life together, then I'll come and I'll help you out. No. Now, there's good things to say about getting jobs and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of our giving and in terms of these alms that we provide for someone in need, we don't wait for them to cross a bar before we say, now you're good enough and we'll do it. Because God doesn't. God allows the evil farmer to enjoy sun and rain as well. So that's God's heart for the needy, for the powerless, for the helpless. James even emphasizes this. He says, okay, listen, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. Do you know the answer to this? You probably read this. Because if I was writing the Bible, I would write in the next phrase, religion that's pure and undefiled before God is someone who sits down and memorizes Scripture day after day and loves God's Word. And it could be any of a number of things I could put in there. But when he says religion, by the way, he means in the best sense, you could really better translate that worship. So your attitude in terms of your response to God, what is your response to God characterized by? Oh, well, I'm singing all the time the praises of God. When I walk down the sidewalk, I stop people and say, hey, do you know God? He just loves. Is that what pure religion is? What does pure worship in response to God look like? And James goes on and he says, here's what it is: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Oh, wait. I thought pure religion was coming on Sundays and singing and praying and loving God and all that kind of stuff. And James says all that stuff is not included here. Pure response to God is how you deal with those who are needy. Back to the Old Testament idea that righteousness and giving to those needy are one and the same thing. It's so characteristic of a changed heart. They go hand in hand. So James says, forget about all the other rigmarole about what you do. And at the time they were arguing about circumcision and all that kind of stuff and eating kosher food and all that kind of jazz. No! Pure religion is this. How do you deal with orphans and widows? The perfect definition of needy and without power. How do you deal with them? And he doesn't just say, do you think about them? He says, visit them. And this word, this is one of my favorite words in the New Testament. That word right there, I won't show you the word, but it literal translation means to look in on somebody. It means literally to look in on. And I like that because that's what we do. Someone who's closed in and you haven't seen them and they're not visible in front of you. Widows and orphans often do not walk down the center of the street talking about how needy they are. They're usually someplace where you got to go find them. Do you go looking for people who are in need like that? Do you go to look in on them? Jesus says this many times, too, about visiting people in prison. Do you go look in on them? Is that your attitude? Do you care about them? Are they part of your thinking? Do you go look in on them? By the way, that look in on, it's a great word. I should have put the Greek up there so you could chase it down to yourself. It's a wonderful word. But when it talks about Jesus as God coming into his creation in the incarnation, it says he came to look in on us. I really like that. He came in to look in on us. And who? To look in on us, those of us who are needy and powerless and crying out for help, just like he talked about before. So that's what he does in our lives. And that's what we do in the lives of others because of that very heart that's been recreated in us. Here's another great example about this alms stuff. This centurion, Cornelius, up in Caesarea. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. You see how that giving alms to the needy kind of figures in the statement of his righteousness? And this guy's a Roman soldier, a Roman, commander soldier. He prayed continually to God. And what goes on after that? About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly a vision. An angel of God came in and said to him, Cornelius! And of course, the big brave centurion stared at him in terror and said, What is it, Lord? And he said to him, Your prayers and your alms, that's giving to the poor, have ascended as a memorial before God. Isn't that interesting that be mentioned? I would just put in there, your prayers have risen to God. But it says, no, your prayers and the actions of a transformed heart that cares for those who are needy and powerless. God's seen that stuff. And that's what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 6 right here. God sees that stuff. And that actually, when you talk about righteousness, righteousness is the outward working of a transformed heart. The good works, what Jesus calls the good works. And so he says, he looks at Cornelius. Cornelius not only prayed and was devout in many ways, but it was evidenced by the fact that his heart was always looking out for those who were needy and poor. Now, at this point, I'm starting to feel a little indicted about the fact that that's not that high on my list. I mean, this is a big deal. I do care for those who are in need, but not quite like this. Not to where it's actually equated to what righteousness is. It's a huge deal in God's economy. Mark 12. Remember, this guy comes up to Jesus, says, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus answers, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Yeah, okay, that sounds right. And then there's a part B. Remember the part B? The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So not only is almsgiving equivalent to righteousness from an Old Testament perspective, Jesus himself, when asked about what the greatest commandment is, love God with all you are, and then love those that God loves, which makes sense. Love those that God loves. Do you do both those? You can't have the one and not do the other. There's no way you can love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then look at those who are needy and despise them and walk past them. Because your heart being transformed by who God is, your response is to do what God would do in that particular case. So Jesus says that's the whole thing. The whole law is summed up in this. We saw in another passage where he quotes this. That's how way up there on the list, your visibility and your looking in on the poor and seeing to their needs is there. I mean, it's huge. So that's why during Jesus' time, it was such a great temptation for the religious, for the pious, to take this requirement, quote, of the law, this expectation of a transformed heart, and to strut around and say, well, I do that all the time, because that's equivalent to righteousness. That's what they would do. And they'd somehow make it known to other people. In Matthew 25, now this shocks some people. There's this final judgment of the sheep and goats. Remember, he's separating the sheep and goats. Verse 35, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. That's the entire definition of looking in on widows and orphans and the powerless. And of course, in their minds, when he says that, verse 40, they say, well, how's that happening? He says, truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me. So here's the interesting point. When we help those in need, not only are we displaying God's heart, but we're actually worshiping God. You do it to me. You're not just doing it to people. You're actually doing it to me. It's the ultimate form of worship. And James already said that. It's the ultimate form of worship. It actually is worship in that sense. So if you're thinking worship is what we do on Sundays in here, and that there is worship in this, but at a much different plane. Worship is how you respond to the needy and poor in the same way that God does. And in fact, that's worshiping God himself. And Jesus says at the end of all time, I'm going to basically look at your actions when it comes to the poor and the needy, and I'll understand where your heart's at. Well, you know what? Jesus already knows where our heart's at. So when I read this passage, I think, well, he doesn't really need to look at how I treat the poor because he knows where my heart's at. He sees the hidden heart. He's telling us this, and so that we'll understand our hearts ourselves. You know, was your life, was your heart driven towards looking in on those who are weak and needy and poor? I mean, does that characterize your life? Because if it does, then your heart's in the place that God has changed it and transformed it, and that's where you should be. And that's an evidence of that fact. Does your heart, when you go past someone who's homeless on the street, does your heart go out to them? Or do you just say, this is an awkward moment, I'll try and figure out how to walk around this? And I don't want to make a list of things for you to do, but that action is more telling about your heart than anything else is. And that's what Jesus is saying. This is going to be the determiner, because those who are mine end up living with transformed hearts that are like God. You react the same way God does. And when you see someone in need, your heart goes out to them. That's what he's saying. And in fact, this is the central issue. There is no other issue in this judgment passage that he brings up that he's going to judge you by. Isn't that interesting? It's because, again, from the Old Testament, almsgiving, or how you deal with the needy, is a perfect picture of the status of your heart, whether it's been transformed by God. It just is. And it's equivalent to righteousness. So you did it to me. That's really worship. So he says, look, practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them is a grotesque blasphemy in the face of that. It is and this is what I really want to dwell on. I mean, you understand what it's like about giving to others and having a heart that goes out for the poor. So, yeah, this is what I want to get at. This contrast right here is a grotesque blasphemy. Because on the one hand, remember, Jesus just told us at the end of Matthew, judgment is going to be about where your heart's at when it comes to those who are needy and helpless. That's a huge indicator of where your heart is at. And then Jesus says here in Matthew 6, think about the fact that some people actually go around and take an opportunity to help those who are needy and helpless in order to make their own sense of importance be bigger. This is why it's a grotesque kind of blasphemy, and I call it I have it call it by two names. I call this the selfish switch, where you switch from worshiping God by helping the poor to actually aggrandizing yourself in other people's eyes. It's just gross. Or the other phrase that I use is called vanity insanity. So here's the deal. God wants us to have a heart for those who are needy and helpless, who call out to us. And in so doing, Jesus says, you're actually doing it for me because these are the people that I love. What an incredible tragedy. What an insane idea it is to take that opportunity to worship God in actuality and use it as a way to glorify yourself. See the switch? It's grotesque. It's absolutely grotesque. And at the end of time, God's going to make very clear to you those times where you thought you were doing something for him when actually you're doing something for yourself instead. That's why this just stinks to high heaven. It's a fundamental definition of worship to help those who are needy and helpless, and you turned it into an opportunity to have people praise you. Wait a second. Wasn't this all about having your works shine before other men so that they'll praise me, God? And you perverted that into something so people will praise you. That's why this really stinks, why this is just so bad. Here's the interesting thing. On the left, you have kind of the righteous motivation and attitudes. You did it to me. It's a worship issue. On the right, you have practicing your righteousness so that you'll be seen by them, kind of religious theater in that sense. In the middle are these good works. And what's interesting is the good works always look the same, whether or not you're on the left side of the screen or the right side of the screen. It's not a matter of what the good works are. You know, helping someone to cross the street, Boy Scout style, or bringing food to someone who can't get out to the store during the epidemic because they don't want to mingle with other people, and so the food in their house goes down and you buy for them, right? These are all good works. There's just no disputing this. And so when people say, well, are you condemning me for the good things that I do? No. No, it's not really the nature of the good works that's at issue here. It's the issue of the nature of your heart in doing them. And here's the distinguishing. On the left side here, what you're doing in these good works is you're literally giving. You're giving to someone. You're not taking in any sense, and you're glorifying God in the process. That's totally a giving attitude on your part. You're getting nothing in return for all of that. It's just a pure worship idea. Is what it is. But on the right side of this screen, we're talking about earning as a result of doing the things, or self-promoting. So that's the difference in the attitude. It's the same good work, exactly the same good work. We're not debating the good work whether it's beneficial for someone else. But on the left side, you're doing it because your heart is stirred, because God's changed your heart, and it's just a natural outflow of who you are, and God's built that in you, and you do it, and as you do it, you glorify who God is and not yourself. But on the right side of the screen, you're doing it because you're hoping people see you, and you're hoping that you get bigger as a result in their eyes. It's all about self-promotion. It's all about self-promotion, and it's all about taking in the process. That's what you're taking, you're earning. So good works aren't bad because they're good works, but they can be bad if you're using them to earn something for yourself. You see the difference? The left side is about giving, the right side is about taking. It's supposed to be so hidden that nobody sees it, because basically it's worship between you and God. It's worship between you and God. Worship between you and God should never be something that you're mindful of how people think of me while I'm doing it, or else you're doing it for yourself. And this, I think, is where this passage starts to have some traction in our lives. Is we're very self-conscious many times in religious contexts, as well as how we carry ourselves in culture ethically. We're very conscious about what people think of us. And so we want to modify how they think of us. Why? Well, so they'll think better of us. Well, that's all about self-promotion, right? That's all about taking for you, and not about doing something selflessly that no one will see. And I would dare say that any time in the midst of you doing something for God, any time that you become self-conscious about what people will think of you when you do it, you've drifted over to the right side of the screen. And this is where it gets a little touchy. Because, if you just leave it in the area of alms, giving to the poor and stuff like that, there's enough there for us to go back to God and say, God, I really I need your help on this. But the issue is, anything you do in the context of righteousness, that can mean not only in church, but in where the place you go. If you're too mindful about, I hope people think better of me as I do this. I mean, I'm not going to go as far as blowing my own horn while I do it. I'm not going to take an ad out in the newspaper saying, look at me, or like the celebrities Eric is saying, they take out an ad, I'm righteous and virtuous, aren't I? Look what I've done. We don't do that. But we still hope. We still hope that if it leaks out what we do, people look at us and say, they're a good person. If that goes in there, you just drifted off of the pure worship side, which is 100% giving. It has nothing to do about how you benefit from it, and you moved over into the earning side, where you hope this earns some kind of public support in that sense. Even earning in terms of God's well thinking of you. I'll do this and God will think better of me if I do this. That's why the good works, the works-oriented religions, that's totally right screen issues. It's about, I'll do these good works, I know what the good works are, and in doing these good works, I'll be diligent, and God will recognize how diligent I've been, and now I will earn something in God's eyes because I've proven how righteous I am, because after all, giving to the poor is the same as righteousness. I'll earn that in God's eyes, maybe earn that in other people's eyes, and then in the self-promotion sense, hope that people will think of me better than I really am. And that's putrid, because this is pure worship. And you have perverted pure worship into self-promotion. And that really stinks. Really, really stinks. How do you get away from that? Well, Jesus already told us. Do it so secret that your right hand didn't even know what your left hand's doing. I mean, just if you're going to worship God and this outpouring of who you are, do it as quietly as you can, or else you invite the temptation to hope people see what you're doing. It's a difficult balance. On the left side, in the righteous sense, it's really all about God, what He's done for me, and so I do for you. And on the right side, it's all about me. That's the perversion of worship. That's the perversion of worship. It's all about me. By the way, before I quit, I'll give you one kind of other thing. In the 21st century church, there's great temptation to step across the line on this. Like Jesus said, practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. Now, I'm not condemning modern day church formats necessarily, but I'm just saying that this is a horrible temptation to practice your righteousness in front of other men without you sometimes even knowing the fact that you're hoping in some sense they're seeing you and understanding how righteous you are. Now, this happens anytime you're up in front of people in a religious context. I struggle with this every time I speak. I think, well, what would they think of me if I show a video of me in the shower? No, I don't worry about that because you know me. And don't ask the question about whether I was wearing swim trunks. You don't ask Scotsmen what's underneath their kilt, so just don't. But the issue is that if you're in front in a religious context, in a worship context, even with musicians, there's a gigantic temptation and struggle to worry about what people will think of you. And if you do well after the fact, you'll say to yourself, well, okay, I'll get some accolades. I hope someone noticed what I did. Oh, no, man, you just walked over the line of the perversion of taking a wonderful, glorifying thing to God, and you've turned it into a perversion about self-promotion. So in the modern day church, the formats for the modern day church are very rock concert-like. Now, I'll be candid with you. I love rock concerts. But I go to a rock concert to appreciate the group that's playing and who's performing, to appreciate their music for what they're creating. And that, there's really nothing wrong with that in that sense. I've gone to some great rock concerts, lost permanently some of my hearing because of some of them. But still, that's not what worship on a church context is about. It's not about glorifying the music and the people that are in the context of what they're doing. It's not about glorifying the pastor who's very charismatic and puts together his words in ways that I think are just kind of supernatural. Wow, he's just great. What church do you go to? I go to so-and-so's church. Yeah, you see how you very easily cross the line here. You don't have to, but this format is prone to that. That's the problem. The format is prone to it. So I'm just mentioning it to you because I know you will go to other churches, or even just when you're here. And the idea when you go to those other churches is you need to be a little bit on the lookout for this. Are we promoting God, or are we promoting ourselves? It's a very I don't know what I want to call it, a toxic kind of temptation in the modern day church because the format that's chosen. That's all I'm saying. For instance, for a while in between, before we came to Utah, we actually we held a house church in our house for, I don't know what, like 6 months, 9 months, something like that. Kind of Christian refugees in the midst of some turmoil at the time there. And so we took care of them in our house, and we had house church. It was like maybe 20 people, tops maybe 30 people in our living room, tight enough that, if you had to wear masks and sit 6 feet apart, it wasn't going to happen. But it was a really touching time. It was our first time we'd ever done that kind of a thing. And you pray very intimately, you sing very intimately, you discuss the scriptures very intimately. There's really, because of the format, there's really very little temptation to go in there and say, I want to worship God and I hope people see me doing it. I mean, you just don't care. Because it's really between you and God and doing it together with the body of Christ. That temptation's not there. But when you get to a rock concert format, the temptation is gigantic. It's just gigantic. My personal pet peeve when it comes to worship bands is to get them off the stage. They don't need to be on a stage. If you ever go into an opera, where does the music sit? Off the stage in a dugout below the ground. So in a way, when we put people up in front, we're tempted to be seen and tempted to hope people say good things about us. It doesn't have to be the case, but the format ends up leading into the temptation. That's all I'm saying. So there's I don't want to get down on the modern church because I think modern church is doing a lot of really great stuff in many contexts. I'm just saying that the format leaves open the temptation to think about being seen in performing rather than just giving glory to God in what you do. It's a difficult thing to do. So, in that context, especially since we're talking about worship right now, is there a context? Because we suffer from this as well, I think. I already mentioned to you, I have to check my heart before I stand up in front of you. Our worship team has to check their heart before they stand up in front of you. I mean, are we doing this so that people will think good of us, or are we doing this because we just, in a pure sense, want to worship God? We want to offer. It's a difficult thing. So even here we have that problem. It's always a temptation. It's a temptation in your personal life. If you relate to someone, something you did that was charitable or relatively good, or it comes up, I mean, it's always a temptation. If in any context, not just in church, but in your personal life, you're thinking about, I hope they see this, or I wonder what they'll think about me because of this, rather than I'm just going to do this because I love worshiping God, then you're moving into the dark side. It's a temptation to worry. It's really the determination, and when we talk about people who are people pleasers as opposed to God pleasers. You know, are you doing what you do because you want to please God, because you just love Him and just want to serve Him and you want to glorify who He is? Or are you doing it because you're trying to please people, hoping that they look at it and they respond in a certain kind of way? We'd like to say we're never in that right side of the camp, but we often go that way, and Satan tempts us to move onto that side all the time. So in any context, is there a context where you can worship in a pure sense? Is there anywhere you can go where you don't care about what people think, who no one's going to see you? And since we've been in this shut-in at home, there's a place at home. You know, what's your worship life been like at home? No one's seeing what you're doing. No one's seeing when you pray. No one's seeing when you sing. I mean, is there a place? Yeah, at home is a great place to do that. In your car when you're driving, no one's seeing. You just do it, worship. The purest worship actually happens outside of a public context like this. So I asked myself, well, in my personal life, is there a place that I worship purely where I don't worry about what people see? There is. Is there a place of worship where I will not be tempted to be seen and admired, to sing praises to an audience of one? Well, there is. And this is one of those places. Why is it one of those places? Well, first off, this right here, the shower itself. I love showers. But do you realize what a luxury this is? I mean, really, in most of the world, people struggle just to find enough water to stay alive, let alone take a shower. They have to walk many times in their village, long, long distances, carrying water in buckets to be able to have enough water just to survive. But here, it's coming out of the wall in seemingly endless quantities. And on top of that, it's warm. So this always brings me to worship when I'm in the shower. I know it's a very strange thing, but I think about this not only in terms of what a great blessing this is and how unusual this is, but because this is also sort of a sign of God's showers of blessing, what He does in our lives all the time. I can't help but become worshipful when I'm in the shower because, well, God showers me with so many things, and warm water is a wonderful thing. And then there's the added plus of being in the shower. I can sing. And it sounds pretty good. And the nice thing about it is there's no one else to hear. It's just me and God. There's no one else around. There's no temptations to perform or to be self-conscious about how badly I'm performing. It's just me and God. There's no fancy sound systems. There's no drum sets. There's no cool lighting effects with smoke machines and colored water. It's just me and God. And I can worship, and I can be thankful for what He's given to me, and it's just me and Him. And songs come to my mind like, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for His love endures forever. We were wandering and lost, and our Father brought us home to a safe dwelling place, to a feast of joy and gladness. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good.